the whole region. You can sometimes wonder, how is it that such a sort of leader of the working class can come out of a little kind of rural backwater like that? And it's because there was this layer of workers that crisscrossed the Australian continent, the Tasman Sea, the Pacific Ocean. There was a single labour market between Australia, New Zealand and the west coast of North America. It was easier to get to Australia from California than it was easier to get from California to Australia than from California to New York in those times. And there were no sort of passports or impediments like that. Harry met a worker who had done this, a compositor, a print compositor who had composed type in Calcutta and pulled a press lever in Arizona. That's great. And this guy had long political discussions with Harry, who was about 15 years old at the time. And he brought a library of 2 books. One was Marx's Capital, and the other was a utopian socialist novel called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, which was extremely popular at the time. Harry looked at the Marx and said, it's way too difficult. I'm sure he's not the only one who's done that. But he was entranced by the Bellamy book. And that sort of utopian vision of socialism that's explained through that book. You can find the book online for free, and it's worth having a look at, in fact. But despite all its inadequacies, that sort of vision of socialism guided him for the next 15 or 20 years. And the main thing he learned from it is that the agent of change in the society is the working class. The workers are not just downtrodden and exploited, but they're the key to transforming society. And of all the lessons we can learn from Harry, that on a certain level it's kind of the most obvious one, but it's one of the ones that's been most forgotten today, I think. Okay, so fast forward 20 years. Harry's been through some big political battles, organising a union of sweatshop clothing workers successfully. Some of them won 100% pay rise and full back pay and so on. But also he's had some setbacks and defeats. He finds himself at that point still trying to pursue his trade as a printer. He's now a proprietor of a little labour-aligned newspaper in Queanbeyan where he did his apprenticeship. But it's a commercial arrangement. He has to make a living out of it, and so along with articles on the labour movement, there's a lot of garbage and local gossip and notes on how to grow vegetables and horse racing. All sorts of things which are of less interest to Harry anyway. And on the other hand, he also has his old friends who used to be in the Socialist League with him and who are now leaders of the Australian Labor Party, and who are sort of tempting him with easy parliamentary life if only he compromises politics. And it was an extremely difficult position to find himself in. He was rescued from that predicament by events that happened on the other side of the world, two in the year 1905. The first was a revolution that broke out in Russia against the monarchy. A massive strike wave broke out. You've probably seen old pictures of the Tsar's troops gunning down a demonstration, which triggered the revolution in this huge revolutionary wave, the biggest sort of workers' upsurge since the Paris Commune of 1871. And although it never quite toppled the Tsar, it really did shape European capitalism to its roots. So while that was happening in Russia, on the other side of the Northern Hemisphere. In Chicago, there was a founding conference of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And they sort of recognized the importance, the IWW recognized the importance of the revolution taking place in Russia. And claimed it as their own and set a new revolutionary course for the labor movement in the United States. They were for industrial unionism, a union covering all the workers in an enterprise rather than weak separate unions for the different trades. They were for workers relying on their own organized strength rather than on sort of arbitration courts and so on. They were against racism. They were for organizing all the workers, irrespective of skin pigmentation and sex and other divisions that keep us separated. And all of these ideas had huge implications for the labour movement in Australia and New Zealand. This is the time of Australian Federation, where they were sort of erecting the White Australia policy was being erected as a barrier to migration of Chinese workers and so on. Indentured labourers from the Solomon Islands were treated as almost as slaves on the Queensland sugar cane plantations. They were ideas that Harry had been kind of groping towards on his own, but without support. And suddenly he felt these sort of big reinforcements coming to his aid, and it kind of reinvigorated him. He got rid of the newspaper in Queanbeyan and headed back to Sydney, where he joined up with the most sort of international-minded workers in that city, a lot of whom were Germans. There were migration to Australia, you tend to think of it all coming from the British Isles, English, Scottish, Irish. There were a lot of Germans, there were Russians that were fleeing from the Tsarist labor camps in Siberia. They head further east and come down through Japan to Australia. There's a big Russian population in Brisbane that took part in the general strike of that city in 1912. You sort of, Australia was like that. So the lesson from that is just that what happens in every part of the world has a big and direct effect on what was happening in Australia and New Zealand, and still does, of course. Okay, fast forward another 7 years. We have to skip over a whole lot of important events. Another 7 years later, Harry's in New Zealand. He arrived just at the beginning of the Waihi gold mine strike, which was the biggest and most hard-fought industrial battle in New Zealand up to that point. And he became one of the leading defenders of the Waihi strikers. The mine owners tried at first to starve the workers back to work, and that didn't work. The union held strong, thanks mostly to a lot of solidarity from Australia. So then they tried another tack. They just recruited hundreds of cops to go in and arrest the leadership and drag them off to jail, and also strike-breaking thugs to assault the strikers and provoke fights and work with the cops in that way. And all of this culminated in a raid on the union headquarters, which led to a worker being beaten to death, and then the strikebreakers rampaging through Waihi and physically, violently driving the strikers out of the town. And it was something that had never been seen before. It's not that unusual to such events in North America, but it hadn't been seen in New Zealand before. Workers were sort of shocked and angry, but also disoriented by it. It looked very bleak, but Harry, as far as I know, he was the only one who sort of understood that they weren't beaten yet. One of the things that happened, because the worker had been beaten to death, they had to have a coronial inquest into his death, and they tried to sort of set it up and shut it down quickly without any input from the union. Harry was a reporter for the Māori Land Worker, and he said, "We have the right to observe this inquest." The union got drawn into the inquest, demanded to be able to put the workers' side and speak for the family of the slain worker. And so Harry was able to take notes on this. The coroner himself was one of the leading strike breakers. But they were able to break it open, and out of Harry's notes on that inquest came the book that Roger mentioned, The Tragic Story of the Waihi Strike, which explained the issues to a lot of workers who didn't understand it. You know, a lot of it was peculiar to the mining industry, and the issues weren't necessarily widely understood beyond the miners. And they organised, they rushed it into print, and then distributed this book through the sort of union networks in hundreds of copies, and organised discussions on the book. And this big campaign that became the sort of, this book was the vindication of the strikers. And they exposed the treachery of the pro-arbitration unions that had taken part in busting up the strike. And they won the argument. That book kind of turned the course of history and turned this defeat on the picket line into a political victory. And it was one of the, and suddenly now, instead of the militants being isolated and defeated, it was the pro-arbitration forces that suddenly started to feel on the defensive. And there's another important lesson in that, I think, which tends to get lost today, which is just the importance of arguing with people who have a different point of view, winning people over to correct ideas. And as part of that, the importance of unions taking action on the political plane as well as the industrial work. Have I got time for one more?
One more, of course.
The final story I wanted to tell was from 1920. So we've skipped another huge amount of material. We've skipped the whole First World War and the fight against conscription and so on. In 1920, Harry had the opportunity to tour the Pacific Islands. He had been elected to Parliament in 1918. As one of the first things that happened in the war, as far as New Zealand goes, was that they invaded and occupied Samoa, which had been a German colony up to that point, and seized it in the name of the British Empire. Any goodwill that they enjoyed from Samoans evaporated very fast when they introduced influenza to the island immediately after the war in November 18, I think it was, which had a disastrous effect. I think nearly a quarter of the population of Samoa died in that pandemic. New Zealand had been granted rule over Samoa by a League of Nations mandate following the war, which basically just sort of cemented in place the Allied victory of 1918. But one of the provisions of this mandate was that there would be a prohibition on slavery. And so when the New Zealand government announced its intention to continue the system of indentured Chinese labourers, Harry objected, saying indentured labour is slavery, and he wrote a pamphlet about that, about indentured labour, not just in Samoa but in Fiji and South Africa and other places as well. At that time, the New Zealand rulers were really fearful of an uprising of these indentured labourers. China was already in the throes of the revolution since 1911 that overthrown the Qing Empire. And it animated not just people in China, but Chinese workers all over the world, including in Samoa. Similar things were happening among Indian workers, Indian indentured labourers. Under the impact of the big independence movement led by Gandhi. And in 1920, as Roger mentioned, the indentured labourers of Fiji went on strike. There was a big sort of wave of strikes. And New Zealand sent a gunship and troops to help suppress the strike. They also sent a parliamentary delegation to sort of investigate and report back. And because Harry and there was other Labour MPs in Parliament at that stage, they said, well, we want to be on that too. And they couldn't refuse them. And so Harry went on this ship called the Monowai, which went to Fiji, then Aitutaki and the Cook Islands, then Niue, and then American Samoa, and finally Western Samoa, as it was then. Harry and 3 other Labour MPs went along. Harry was really in his element on this. He was, once again, he was kind of talking to workers about, who were fighting for their rights, telling the truth of their strikes, and reporting back to the working class in New Zealand through his articles in the Māoriland Worker and through his speeches in Parliament and so on. And he did this in India first. They tried to prevent him from going ashore and speaking to the striking workers, but he defied their bans and he was able to do that. And he did the same in Samoa. He wrote a pamphlet about the shocking history of New Zealand colonial rule in Samoa. And through that he became a close collaborator of Taisi Olaf Nelson, one of the central leader of the Mau movement for independence in Samoa, which lasted for the rest of his life. So that was just another thing. I think it's a shining example of how a workers' leader can make use of the parliamentary platform to build solidarity with workers' struggles around the world like that. So I've gone on too long. There's just a few anecdotes from Harry's life, which I think are interesting and telling. There's an awful lot more you can say about Harry, but you'll have to buy the book for that.